You're listening to Myers-Briggs Question Corner with Edythe Richards.
Think back for a minute to a conversation you had when you knew the other person wasn't listening to what you had to say. They may have been nodding appropriately, made eye contact, inserted a few uh-huhs here and there, but their mind was elsewhere. And boom, as soon as you finish speaking, they lean right in with their probably very self-centered response. Now, admit it, you've done it too. Think about Carol over there who goes on and on and on. You already know what she's going to say, so you get busy focusing on a firm but diplomatic response. You wait until she's finished rambling and you deliver your response. Second scenario. Let's say that Carol is talking about something that's really exciting to you, and you just can't wait to jump in because you've had the exact same experience. So you interrupt her before she's finished. Third scenario. Carol is telling a story, but she has this way of drawing it out, so what could be said in 30 seconds takes 10 minutes. You don't have time for all those twists and turns, so you speed things up, finish her sentence for her, so you can get to the punchline and move on. In all three of these scenarios, you were too busy thinking about what you were going to say next to actually listen to Carol in a genuine way. How does this relate to Myers-Briggs types? Well, I actually can't find any reliable correlation between Myers-Briggs types and interrupting, and only one poll on a similar topic by the website 16 Personalities. The researchers asked participants to agree or disagree with the following. In a conversation, you often find yourself too busy anticipating what you're going to say to really hear the other person. Surprisingly, it was the NT, intuitive thinking types, who most agreed with this statement. Of the 4 members of this group, which includes ENTJ, ENTP, INTJ, and INTP types, INTP types were the most likely culprits, followed closely by INTJ types. This poll may be somewhat anecdotal, but the data implies that INTP and INTJ types are the most likely Myers-Briggs types to let their minds wander when someone else is talking. Does this mean that they are also likely to interrupt? In my own professional opinion, that depends on the person. I've met and worked with many INTJ types who interrupt people a lot, but absolutely hate to be interrupted. Some, but not all, of these INTJs are super smart people who get bored by the pace of the exchange and they want to check that off the box so they can move on. Others are hard of hearing or have ADD. Some people just want to dominate and have absolutely no care or awareness of the people they're supposedly conversing with. Oh, and then there are the socially anxious people. These folks compensate for their anxiety by showing off. They're much more focused on the impression they're making than they are about the exchange with the other person. I've also worked with and known a lot of INTP types, and this is just my own experience. I've found that INTJs interrupt more than INTPs. This is most likely due to the difference between extroverted thinking, which is what INTJs use, and introverted thinking, which is the dominant function for INTPs. Thinking, as we recall, is the function used to make decisions logically, with truth as the objective. People who use extroverted thinking, like INTJs, focus their decisions externally, applying rational thought to the outside world. They want everything to make sense, to be in order, and they want tasks and projects to be done quickly. They have little patience for mulling over decisions. They'll push forward when coming up with a plan. They love to get things done, and they love to control their outer environment. Keeping things efficient is very important for INTJs and anyone who uses extroverted thinking as a dominant or auxiliary function. Now, INTPs use introverted thinking, and this is an internal function used to organize processes and frameworks to determine how things work. INTP types and other types who use this function constantly modify things based on lessons they've learned. independent discoveries. Essentially, they're forming a blueprint for how the world works, and they're always open to new insights and information. They're constantly troubleshooting and analyzing, and it's all going on internally, so they're not going to extrovert this function to others. Thus, they may not be paying attention as closely in a conversation, but they're not as apt to interrupt overtly. Instead, they're figuring out how this exchange fits into their internal model of the world. Now, I bet you're wondering why I'm not calling all the extroverts out on interrupting others. That's because I don't believe that extroverts interrupt more than introverts. According to a recent study from Northwestern University, interrupting is highly gendered. Males interrupt females 3 times as often as the reverse. Females are interrupted more than males, who are their professional equals, and surprisingly, more women than men are interrupted by their subordinates. Meanwhile, a separate study from the George Washington University found that men interrupted 33% more often when they spoke with women than when they spoke with other men. So it seems that women still in today's age have to fight to be heard. But this study didn't account for culture or nationality. Italians, for example, are known for their lively, loud discussions and may regularly talk over each other, while in many Asian cultures, the preferred way to communicate is to leave gaps in between each person's turn in a conversation. Catherine Hilton, a linguistics doctoral candidate from Stanford, identified 2 distinct groups of American English speakers: high and low intensity speakers. High intensity speakers are generally uncomfortable with moments of silence in conversation and consider talking at the same time a sign of engagement. Low intensity speakers find simultaneous chatter to be rude and prefer that people speak one at a time in conversation. The high-intensity group reported that conversations where people spoke simultaneously when expressing agreement were not interruptive, but engaged and friendlier than conversations with pauses in between speaking turns. In contrast, the low-intensity group perceived any amount of simultaneous chit-chat as a rude interruption, regardless of what the speakers were saying. Now, I believe that our families also have a pretty big impact on whether we interrupt and how much or how little we care about being interrupted. I myself was raised in a household where we never interrupted each other, where everyone's opinion was heard, and where it was polite to let one person have the floor at a time, and the expectation was to pay attention to that person. A low-intensity household, if we go by the previous definition. And I admit now that I can't stand it when people interrupt me. I think it's incredibly rude, and I hate seeing other people interrupted too. I'll mention that my Myers-Briggs preferences are for ENFP. And I've got a colleague, also an ENFP, who is a constant interrupter. She admits that she grew up in a very loud Italian family where people were talking all at once, talking over each other, and it was pretty chaotic. In other words, a high-intensity family. She had to navigate all of that and fight to be heard. We've talked about interrupting, and she told me that she thinks nothing of it. No big deal, she says. So what about judgers and perceivers? Here's a case in point. Judgers are apt to dislike being distracted in their work. Often they'll go for a focused sprint to the finish line. Perceivers, on the other hand, are apt to wander off the path in order to explore unexpected avenues. We may therefore assume that judgers dislike being interrupted more than perceivers. But is this necessarily true? Judging and perceiving and introversion and extroversion are preferences. They aren't absolutes. Let's remember that each person is an actual person with a unique personality apart from his or her Myers-Briggs type. My opinion on which Myers-Briggs types interrupt the most is there isn't one. Interrupting is highly contextual. Different people are going to interrupt for different reasons. If we're looking at this purely from a Myers-Briggs perspective, which for reasons I've explained, I don't think is a good idea to do, It may seem that both extroverted types and judging types are more likely to interrupt others, and perceiving types most likely not to mind being interrupted. But I don't think this tells the whole story.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you'd like to hear more, or you'd like to submit a question yourself, then you can find us at www.atopcareer.com. Until next time. MBTI and Myers-Briggs are registered trademarks of the MBTI Trust.